So my name is Prema Arnava Das. I'm from Ireland, and I was born in 1970 and joined to ISKCON in 1991. So going back in my life, I was born in a Christian family in a place called Belfast. And I always believed in God. You know, with my family, we would attend church every week and like that. And but I kind of remember, all through my life, I had some kind of a spiritual calling, you know, and I remember, actually, even when I was a child, I remember being afraid of the big wide world out there, you know. You know, like I would observe my father driving the car and I would wonder, how does he know where to go? It seems all so complicated. And I would see, you know, taking care of a house, paying bills and all this kind of stuff. It just seemed frightening to me, you know. And I didn't want to grow up in this complicated world. Possibly it came from a previous life, or maybe I was some kind of renunciate in the last life or something. And I had this, I remember one time we were on vacation in the UK, and we came to some beautiful area where there was a lot of lakes, and there was a big monastery in the middle of the lake. So I was hearing about, you know, how these monks live in the monastery and like that. And after saying that, I was thinking, that's what I'd love to do, you know, run away from the world and stay on some island. And I even had a desire at that point, you know, I'd love to just take a vow of silence and just be disconnected from this world altogether and just worship God, you know. So somehow my parents, they were good in the respect that they were able to instill some kind of faith in God, some kind of devotion. And even I would read at times in my life I was reading the Bible every day, you know, stuff like that. Of course, my life was a little bit contradictory also, you know, like, you know, there was the spiritual or religious aspect, but I also had a desire to do all kinds of nonsense things in my life, you know. And unfortunately, that kind of increased and the spiritual aspect decreased at a certain point in my life as I was growing up. And I remember even consciously making a decision at one point, because I was a very faithful person, but I had all these other desires, and I made a decision, okay, I'm going to follow this materialistic path for some time, and then I'll come back. So that I remember making a conscious choice. And so then I went like full-fledged into all kinds of material enjoyment and the usual kind of nonsense that youngsters get up to. And I lasted for about 2 years until I could see that this way of life wasn't making me happy, you know. And I was, you know, thinking about it, what alternative? There didn't seem to be any alternative, you know, there was nothing else that really interested me. And I was very attached to my friends who were, you know, bad association, you know. And as long as I was with them, there was no chance of improving. So, and I was in such a bad condition, actually, that devotees used to go out chanting Hare Krishna Nam Sankirtan on the streets in Belfast where I lived. And I didn't like it somehow, you know. That was a real demon, you know. And I remember even going into the city with some friends. I remember one conversation particularly, and I was telling my friends, oh, I hope those Hare Krishnas aren't in town today, you know. I don't want to see them, you know. And they were, you know. And I was thinking, oh, why are they doing this, you know? And one of my friends actually said, I think they're chanting this sound. It's meant to have some influence over your mind, you know. And so when I heard that, I even tried not to hear the chanting, you know, in case it would affect me in some way. But actually, one thing earlier on in my life just came back to my mind was one thing that did open me up a little bit to a broader understanding was there was one program on the television, and it was talking about different religions and people who had some vision of God, you know, testifying to, you know, some vision, some special experience they got. So I was kind of interested in stuff like that, and I watched it. And they had people from Christian families who had some experience, some vision, and some Muslims also, and some Hindus also. And I remember hearing the story, and they even showed a form of Lord Narayan with the 4 arms. I was looking at it, and I was thinking, wow, you know, how to process this, how is God appearing in different traditions? And I just, you know, I just understood, you know, God is doing like this. He's appearing to people in different ways. So I realized there's more, because Christians, they always preach, you know, there's only one way, you know. So I realized, no, there's not. There's more than one way. So that opened me up to a higher understanding. And another incident that happened earlier in my childhood just came back to my mind was mostly I was taken to church by force, you know. I wasn't really interested to go. But one week they had this really heavy preacher. I don't know, anyone who's experienced with born-again Christians, you know, sometimes they're screaming and shouting and this and that. So at one point in his talk, he started asking, you know, what does God want you to do for him? You know, because usually we think, you know, God should do what I want. You know, I come with my list of things. So that kind of got me, you know, kind of shocked me, you know. Yeah, what does God want me to do for him? And he gives some different options. Maybe he wants you to be a missionary. Maybe he wants you to be a welfare worker, this or that. And it just made sense to me. Of course, God would want me to be a missionary. Wouldn't he? Wouldn't he want me to spread his word and this and that? And that just stayed in the back of my mind throughout all the nonsense things I was doing, you know. And even I would feel I was doing all the wrong things, but I was feeling guilty about it. I was feeling bad about it. But in the end, as I was explaining, you know, I found this way of life just wasn't satisfying me, and I was looking for an alternative. So one of my father's friends, he was into some organization called the Holy Grail or something like this. And it was based on the Bible, but it accepted karma and reincarnation. So I thought that was interesting. I was reading the books, and I was actually quite fascinated. And then shortly after, I met some devotees and got Prabhupada's books also. So I was shifting between the two. Actually, just when I first came in contact with ISKCON devotees selling books, just before I developed that further, well, there was a shopping mall near the office where I used to work. And one day I was on my tea break, and one Indian Mataji was selling Bhagavatam first cantos in the shopping mall. And she came and approached me, and of course I wasn't interested, so I just walked on. And she came walking after me, you know, and I became angry. I turned around and said, "No, I'm not interested," you know, and I walked off. But actually where my office was, I could see her from the window of my office, and I was watching her, you know, and I was observing the book, the first canto is so amazing, all the Vaikuntha planets and Radha Krishna and Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and all that. And it just, something about the cover, I just knew there was something special in the book. But I couldn't go back, I felt embarrassed after, becoming angry and that. So then I decided that the next time I meet devotees, I'm going to take a book, And the first book I got was the Coming Back. But actually, I did get one before that, one or two before that. But that was the one that had the main effect. So before I got that book, I was reading a couple of Prabhupada's books, along with this other, this Holy Grail book, whatever it was. So I couldn't choose between the two paths. But this one path was saying, how to get free from your karma. And their philosophy was you just undergo all the sinful reactions and get purified. And you keep your consciousness as pure as you can. But it seemed kind of impractical, because, if you want to endure all your bad karma, it means you'll have to suffer like anything, And to keep the consciousness artificially pure is also difficult because the mind's always going here and there. So then reading Prabhupada's books, it was practical. There's a process to purify your consciousness and to get free from your bad karma, it just made so much more sense. So then I diverted into Prabhupada's books. And then when I read the Coming Back, every single thing in that book I just knew it was true, that was the one that really got me. And I knew I had to act on this knowledge, especially the parts of the book that were quoting Prabhupada, because that book's compiled by Prabhupada's disciples, and quotes of Prabhupada from Bhagavatam and for some lectures, and also the stories, the story of King Chitraketu, Ajamil, and Maharaj Bharat. So I was fascinated by those stories also. And then there was one picture that also affected me. It was telling how, if we eat all kinds of nonsense like non-veg and that, we'll get a lower birth in the next life. So it showed a man eating some meat, some non-veg, and it showed the next picture was the picture of a pig. And I realized by looking at that picture, I thought, oh my God, that's my future, So at that point, I seriously started studying Prabhupada's books, And what? It was difficult to give up my sinful life because, I had bad associations, so I was always wondering what to do about it. So, and I didn't want to give up my friends. I was very, very attached. So at one point, my favorite music band, they were playing in London. So I got a flight over to go for to the concert. And everything was a failure. The friends I was supposed to meet and stay with, I couldn't find them. I couldn't contact them by phone. So I had nowhere to stay. And it was a bit of a disaster trip. But I went to the concert anyway. And this band were quite philosophical. And in between songs, they would try and speak some philosophy. But after reading Prabhupada's books, it all just sounded like nonsense to me, And towards the end of the concert, I thought, my God, I'm just going to take to Krishna Consciousness, Doesn't matter what my friends think, I just made a firm choice, whatever it takes, And I just walked out of that concert and decided from this point on, I'm going to change my life. So on my return flight back to Ireland, on the same day, I just came back into Belfast from the airport, and I bumped into a devotee selling books, and he was selling The Higher Taste. And I said, yeah, I already read the Coming Back. I love it, And I bought The Higher Taste. And I read it on the same day I was reading through. From that day, I became a vegetarian. I immediately gave up all my meat eating. And so then I was wondering what to do next. So shortly after that, again, I was on my lunch break or something, walking in the street. And one devotee approached me with some books. And he showed me the book, but it was a book I already had. At that time, I had a few, and I was really disappointed. Oh, I've already got that one. So he said, oh, just wait here a minute, wait here. And he ran to another devotee, and he came back with a magazine. So the local temple at that time, they'd made their own magazine. We have a beautiful temple on an island there, Radha Govinda deities. So that was His Grace Pretu Prabhu, Prabhupada disciple. He was making this magazine. It was called Look Beyond. And there was all kinds of information about the temple, how they're studying these scriptures, how they're leading natural life, living off the land and this and that. And I was really, really impressed. So I decided, yeah, I'm going to go to this place, So I contacted the temple and, arranged to come there. I took 2 weeks vacation from my job and went up to see what it was like in the temple. And everything about it was amazing, because the temple is in the middle of nowhere, some beautiful lakes, beautiful forest, land, they had cows, wildlife, and I was completely, enthralled. And then they took me over and we went into the temple, and it was my first ever darshan of Radha Krishna, They opened the curtains, and wow, it was just like looking into a different world, Radha Krishna. And deities, to me they looked like they were real. Of course, we know they are, as Radha Krishna manifested in that way. But, it seemed to me like they were almost alive, and that was such an experience, the first ever darshan. And so on the same day that I came, I was a little bit shy, because, coming on my own into a Hare Krishna community. So they asked me if I'd eaten, and I had eaten, but they said they'll bring me a little bit of prasadam. So they sat me down in front of a TV, and they were playing a video of Mahabharata, some Mahabharata series. And it was interesting because there was so much wisdom, even though it wasn't the ISKCON thing, but it was full of wisdom, and it's fascinating. Then they brought me the prasadam, and I did prasadam right from the first mouthful. I just loved prasadam. And they brought me another plate. I ate everything, And actually, it was the evening before Ram Navami. The next day was a festival. And my idea was I'm going to try out this lifestyle and see what it's like, and observe the devotees, see how they're living. The books, fine, I'm convinced, but I want to see what it's like in practical life. So I got up the next morning for Mangal Arati, and one devotee showed me how to chant on beads. So I chanted 16 rounds on my first day. And there was two very special Prabhupada disciples there at that time. One was Tribhuvanath Prabhu. They're writing a book about him now. He was very dear to Srila Prabhupada, and he was famous in ISKCON for his kirtans. Yeah, it's well known. So every morning we were getting these incredible kirtans, everyone dancing and going crazy. And I was really attracted to the kirtan also, it was really beautiful music to me, And then there was another Prabhupada disciple from the US, Nalini Kanta. He's the author of a book called The Basics of Bonafide Astrology. He's an astrologer. And he was interesting because he knew all the stories from Mahabharata and like that. So I was getting to hear, from day one, I was getting to hear all this nectar and kirtan and everything. And at the end of the 2 weeks, I didn't want to leave, So I went back to where I was working. I had 2 paychecks waiting for me. I just collected the money, worked for 1 day, and I was never seen there again, That was it. And the final obstacle was dealing with my parents, But I'd already moved out of my home about a month before, And so I was already a little bit disconnected from them. But when I phoned them up and told them, I was joining the Hare Krishnas, they were like shocked, to say the least, What about your job and this and that, And somehow I went to see them, and I managed to explain some things that are similar about Christianity and Krishna consciousness. And they were pacified. I was really surprised, And they kind of more or less gave me their blessings, And so I just got a bus back to the temple, and that was it, Yeah, so I stayed on that temple for a couple of years. It's in the countryside, away from the city. But shortly after I joined, I was sent out on book distribution, and I liked it very much. So they put me on traveling Sankirtan. So I was traveling all over Ireland, distributing books and like that. And then after a couple of years, the management swapped between the Dublin temple and this, island temple in the countryside. So I found myself in the middle of the city. But Tribhuvanath Prabhu, he also went there at that time. So, there was an amazing dynamic atmosphere of preaching and everything. And life was just like a festival every day, Actually, when I remember those days of the beginning in Krishna Consciousness, it was the most perfect beginning you could ever get. It was like a foundation for my whole life. And I still reflect back on it now, I owe everything to those first couple of years, So anyway, I was going and traveling Sankirtan for years. And then I settled in a temple in Cork. It's right in the south of the country. And it was under Trivikram Swami. He wanted to do some preaching in Ireland, and he opened a small center in Cork. And I was there for a while. And then Srila Bhakti Maharaj, he would visit regularly to Ireland. And on that particular trip, he was recommending to devotees that, why don't you come spend some time in India, learn the culture, and like that. And so I was serving Maharaj Prasadam one day, so he was asking, so what about you, And I told, I was very attracted to the idea of going to India and that. He says, so why don't you come then, And yeah, by some means I managed, I won't go into all the details because it will take too long to explain. I managed by tricky means to get free from that temple. And I joined the devotees it was Prabhupada Marathon at that time. I went and joined a Sankirtan van, collected money, bought a ticket to India, and I came. I arrived in Mumbai. I'd never been to India on my own before, always with friends, so I was like terrified, where do I go? But Maharaj had sent one disciple to stay in Juhu temple to take care of me, which was nice. And at that time, we went over to meet Maharaj in Chennai, and he was taking some disciples on a tour of South India. So we went to different places, Srirangam, Kanchi, Madurai, here and there. And he told me, because I decided to come over and stay there, so he told me, there were some disciples preaching in Vishakhapatnam, which was Gokul and the boys, and also in Gujarat, Baroda, some others. So you see which one you like and you can stay. So first we went to Vishakhapatnam, and I liked the mood there. I liked Gokul, Prabhu, and everyone. So I told Maharaj, yeah, I'd like to stay here. So I ended up staying there, and I stayed there for a couple of years, and I came back to Ireland. And at the time when I came back to Ireland, it was a time of, there was a big economic boom. They called it the Celtic Tiger. You know, there was a lot of money floating around, and book distribution was huge. So I ended up getting entangled back in Ireland, in the Irish chapter again. So I ended up staying there because books were going out like anything. And so for years, I was there doing book distribution again. And then later in my life, I decided to change my ashram, get married. So I thought, you know, living in the West, I'll have to work like a donkey to maintain myself. I don't want to do that, you know. So I decided I'll see if I can get married to an Indian girl and shift over to India. It'll be easy. I can make money in the West and come back and forward. And so that's what I did. And I ended up in Hyderabad, where I am to the present day. So going on books over here on the trains and like that, you know. And I love it over here. Preaching in India is nice because in the West you can't give them too much knowledge because they just can't understand, be honest. But in India you can just preach like anything, your shlokas, this and that. It's great fun, you know. So I love it.